Okay, we are live. I hit the go button and then my nose started to tickle like I was going to sneeze. So, bear with me if that happens. I think it's one of those that's just going to threaten. We're ready to get started, and I'm excited to be here today for our Fearless Artist live studio session. We try to do these 3 times a month at least here in the Fearless Artist community for anyone at the membership in my Fearless Artist community. That's where you get access to 20 plus of my online courses, as well as our these live sessions, our interactive student community, which is such a great place to be a learning artist. We learn so much when we share our work and get feedback from each other. When we talk about the mindset problems that we have as we learn to think like an artist as well as to paint like one. I'm thankful to those of you who are able to make the time to join me today. Personally, I'm terrible at showing up on time for live broadcasts. The time zone thing always gets me, and so I really appreciate the commitment that you've made to be here. As we get started, today we want to talk about a topic in my series, Learn to See Like an Artist. We're kind of figuring out our place between the idea of painting what we see and painting what we feel and painting from who we are. I just have one more button I need to press that I forgot about here, so bear with me. I think I did it. Yep, I have a second camera I'm running because I do want to at some point use this content in an online course that will be added to your membership. So we're developing that series right now. Fortunately, I also remembered to fix my microphone because it was set to mute for some reason, and so I think you should all be able to hear me. I'm not seeing anybody who's struggling with that in the chat. So do remember that you can ask questions in our chat here. If you're signed into your Google account and watching on YouTube, you should be able to leave a comment, ask a question. Robin is here to moderate, so she'll field any questions that you have, and I can cover them at the end of the broadcast. Okay, I'm going to look at my notes. I'm going to recap what we talked about in the last session, which was 2 weeks ago. And, you're dealing with me as I develop some new content. And anytime I start recording a new course, I really struggle with the first lesson or two. It always seems like it takes me a little time to get into my groove. And really, I think because I have an idea in my head, I've got some course notes, but once I start talking about it, then my brain really starts going and figuring out better ways to articulate these different concepts. And so you're benefiting, well, you're joining in on the ground floor here. So you're seeing a little bit of that, talking through some ideas and actually pinning them down so we can articulate them. Always a huge challenge. And so bear with me as I do that. So I did feel like 2 weeks ago when we first started talking about this topic, I actually re-recorded all of that content because I wanted to be even clearer on why we are talking about seeing like an artist. We're going to be talking about drawing during this series. And that's something that I kind of have avoided in a lot of my classes. We talk about value, we talk about shape and color, but we very rarely pull out a pencil. And so I wanted to talk about the role drawing plays and how we use drawing in painting. And what I realized was, for myself, I was never a pencil artist. I tried. As a teenager, I used to do a lot of pencil sketching, and I always struggled with it. And working with a brush has always been much more comfortable for me. However, that doesn't mean I wasn't learning to draw. We have a lack of understanding what drawing is. We hear the word drawing and we think about pulling out that pencil and doing that outline sketch of your subject, or maybe even doing a detailed, grayscale, full-on pencil sketch, pencil drawing with a lot more detail. Drawing does not have to involve a pencil at all. We need to redefine drawing. We need to recognize that really when we talk about drawing, most of the time we're referring to this idea of being able to place our objects, the objects in our scene, the things we want to draw, in the correct place on the picture plane. Here comes that sneeze. I can hear you all waiting for me to sneeze, and then it never comes. Okay, so we're redefining drawing. We want to be able to place the objects in the correct place on the picture plane. A really good example of this is if you're drawing a portrait, you want to get those eyes in the right place, you want to get the nose in the right place, and the tiniest bit off, your person stops looking like the person they're supposed to be. In landscape, which is what I mostly paint these days, it's not as crucial, but proportion is important, perspective plays a role, and so we want to have an ability to place our objects with a degree of accuracy. We want our drawing to also reflect an ability to see the shape and value so that our subject is recognizable. And in drawing, we recognize that everything is made up of shapes, and the common drawing strategies that are used to accurately depict subjects are universal. But we have some problems when we start drawing. Number one is I think we get too dependent on our drawing. We get very committed to accuracy. We get hung up on the labels or names of what we're creating. And then the biggest thing, I think, and this is the thing we struggle with in watercolor, whether you're using a pencil or whether you're going straight in with your brush, whether you're using reference photo or looking out your window, even if you're painting from your imagination, we think we live in a 3D world. Everything around us has form and shape. It exists in this 3D space. And when we go to paint, our paper is always only going to be a flat surface. We cannot make 3D objects with our paintbrush, and yet because we're thinking in 3D, we have a tendency to try to paint with all of that three-dimensional knowledge. And this is where I know for me, when I first started to paint, I would pull up a reference photo. Let me see if I have one here to show you. That's not the one I want to show you. Just give me a minute. I am fighting hay fever right now, so if I sound sniffly, that is why. We're just gonna be oblivious, I think, to that. Three-dimensional space means we tend to look at objects and we tend to see the objects behind the objects. Where is it? Well, this is kind of a good example. We'll pop that one up on the screen. So this reference photo here, I'm showing you pictures I take on my walk. These are things I see almost every day. And in this photo, we see trees, we see fence, we see water. And I'm going to speak specifically to the fence. When we see a fence like that and we go to paint it, generally we do not just paint the stuff we see, because the bottom rail of this fence is almost completely obscured by grasses. But when I go to paint it, because in my head I'm existing in this 3D space, I stood there and looked at that fence, my imagination knows that bottom rail of the fence is there, and so I am no longer painting what I see. Very often I will want to paint the complete fence, all three rails that go horizontally, and then I want to paint the grasses in front of it. And that's when I start to struggle with my painting starting to look muddy or overworked, because I'm layering detail over something that doesn't even need to be in the painting. The viewer of my painting isn't supposed to see that. It doesn't exist in that two-dimensional representation of the scene. So because in the two-dimensional representation of the scene, you can't walk over and look, dig through the grass and find that fence rail. All you can see is what the representation is. That's what you have. And so we want to almost this becomes more important when we start painting water, because with water we have the reflection on the water itself, and then whatever is under the water, under the surface. And so those three things start to get really complicated when we want to paint that subject, because in our 3D world, all of those things are happening instead of us looking at our painting and going, okay, what do I see? What do I really see? What really needs to happen in my painting here? So that's really where I want to go today, is just to talk about the practice of giving your brain permission to really just, giving your brain permission really just to see what is actually in the picture and letting go of everything else. And it's really interesting because what happens along the way is when we start to let go of that, we start to think in the abstract almost. And it does take training, it takes time, and we can and you can give yourself permission to take the time to learn this. This is not something you have to learn today. We're just thinking about it today. We're just starting to bring it in and invite it into our thought process. How do I separate all my background knowledge so that I can think in terms of simplifying the scene? I was listening to a podcast I really like. It's called 3-Point Perspective, and they're 3 illustrators. They frequently do illustrations for children's books. They've done some illustration for film, actually. And I think one of the fellows does comic books frequently. So they're always drawing for customers. They're doing illustrations in the commercial field. And they teach illustration. They teach it on a university level. And so when they were talking about drawing, and they use different terminology than we do, but they're often talking about style, they're talking about accuracy, and then finding your space in between. And they said in one of their classes, they were commenting that the best drawers, the people who are the most accurate at rendering the subject, so their description of the word is rendering, someone who's very, very accurate at depicting their subject, is really good at rendering, but their design skills do not always line up. So they might be very, very good at accurately rendering something, but the impact of their overall scene is something that they haven't really thought about. They're just very, very literal in their approach to their subject. And so they were really talking about how you have to sacrifice some of your accuracy, some of your rendering in order to get good design. And good design needs to come first. And that's really where we're going with this. I want to look at my reference photo, and I want to get to the design and let go of some of the background knowledge that I have. Okay, so we're going to talk about water today. And this is I feel myself getting a little bit, I don't know what the word is. It's very hard to talk about this subject, because there is so much involved. But I really think that where we struggle is with the desire to be very literal and to bring our background information into the scene. So when we talk about painting water, we know water is both transparent and reflective, and we know water is fluid. It's always moving. And so when we paint water, we have to, that's a lot of information. It's overwhelming. And so when somebody says to me, I need to know how to paint water, well, we have to start looking at the water itself. And we're going to do that just now. Let's go back to my reference photos here, and let's take a look at what the reference photos have to tell us. And I'm hoping that they'll load the way they're supposed to. Okay, so we've got some different reference photos. A lot of these are just local spring scenes. This one we have the water appears very, very blue, which we know is in our background knowledge, we know that's the reflection of the sky. And so I think our tendency here is to just immediately paint that water very, very blue. But if we zoom in a little bit, and that gives us the opportunity to just kind of start to abstract the scene, take a look at how we have actually some very, very interesting shapes here. We've got the blue of the water. We've got a near black, and it's a very broken shape because we've got the ripples breaking up the reflections of the trees. And then we've got some whites, almost white reflections, and then a little bit of kind of middle value color as well. And so that gives us an understanding that there's a lot more going on than just that first glimpse of, okay, we've got blue water and yes, some dark reflections in it. And sometimes getting closer is a really good way to start thinking more critically and dissecting your water a little bit. This is not just water. In painting, we want to get in close, because instead of seeing just that water, then all of a sudden, come on, move it over. all of a sudden we don't see one thing. We see our white pattern here. We see our darkest darks, and we see that middle, that original blue that struck us so much is our largest shape here, but there's other smaller shapes within it. And so I want to be able to recognize that. I don't need to know what those shapes are in order to paint them. So sometimes it just helps to get a little bit closer to the scene. Okay, I want to show you this. This is kind of fun to do. This is a photo I took just a week or two ago. Very new leaves on the trees. Again, we have the blue reflections, and we can also see some green reflections in the water. And we can see some very dark shadows, either of I think there's some old logs sticking out of the water as well as some reflections there. Now I want to show you what I did with this in my painting. And you might have seen this on my Instagram yesterday. This painting right here. Take a look at that. Let's just pause and look at it for a moment. Okay, so this is my reference, my version of my reference photo, and I had so much fun painting this. I actually started out with just a big path of this yellow, and then the phthalo yellow green here, and that was my major shape, and all of my greens were connected. So the greens in my environment, and I should toggle back to that. Oh, I'm sorry, it hasn't switched over. I clicked on the wrong button. There we go. I think we're having trouble with my photos again, and I can fix that. So let's just backtrack a little bit here. Okay, so this is my painting, and like I said, you can really see the there we go. I think I made it work now. Okay, so reference photo first. And because you've seen my painting now, you can see how the light greens really create one shape through the painting. We've got, or through the scene. We've got those light greens on the left and the right and in the foreground. And I tried to paint those as all one thing in my painting. And then the shadows from my reference photo, take a look at the violet shadows in my painting. And then if we look at the reference photo, we see the shadow areas very much alongside those bright yellow greens. And so I tried to paint those as much of a single element as I could. Because I wanted my sky and water to mirror each other. I also use the same blue in my sky as I did in my water. So they really feel connected to each other. And that was really important to me in this scene. I was actually really, really happy with the first layer of this painting. I was really tempted not to add any of these smaller shapes here. But I'm so glad I pushed a little further and overcame my hesitation to ruin that promising beginning, because it was really good for me to develop those first shapes into that further detail, to bring some darks in. I added a little pop of orange here and there, and I had some of my comments on Instagram were that I could add even more dark purples maybe into the background. I'm not sure if I'll do that or not. If I can see a way to do that, I might. But I'm going to wait and just get to know this painting a little bit. But I wanted to show you this because it's such a good example of how you can take a reference photo, and this one had a lot of detail in it, and turn it into, and really abstract it into those major shapes. And when you do that, it frees you to be interpretive and to do a little bit more improvisation. And I want you to be able to get to that point. Maybe not of painting exactly in this level of looseness. Maybe that's not for you, but I want you to feel free to identify those major shapes and then to use them to develop your painting. Okay, so let's take a look at my reference photos again. I don't think I was able to show you all of them, and so we're going to see if we can't make that work again this time. Sometimes it lets me scroll to the next photo and sometimes it does not. Yeah, see, it's not liking my... I just have to keep fixing the settings on this, I think. Just hang on one moment. Okay, so this is the next one. Let's just take a look at this. In this one, I've converted this reference photo to black and white. This is the color version. And again, it's really not liking me. Let's see here. I've occasionally had trouble with my photos not wanting to scroll, and this is going to be one of those days. We're just going to have to keep adjusting, and it's just going to be slower than usual. Okay, so let's take a look at this reference photo. This is a river scene on a very sunny day, and I want you to take a close look at the pattern of light and dark. As you're watching this, as you're looking at this photo, kind of take a mental note. Where are the lightest values and where are the darkest ones? I'm going to give you a moment to study it. For me, learning to see value is an important part of understanding my reference photos. So for me, this was important to just pause whenever I encounter a new photo or whether I'm looking at a new scene I want to paint. I really want to pause and look for patterns. So I'm looking at the shape of the river. I'm looking at where the whites are, where are the lightest values, where are the darkest values, and then what color is my river? And this river is a multitude of colors, isn't it? We see some kind of brownish greens, I think, in the kind of in the middle part there. We do see a reflection of the sky, but as we get closer to the photographer, who was me in this case, I was waiting for my kids to come kayaking around the corner. But as the water gets closer to me, we start to see the actual color of the water, the silt that's been stirred up, that murky brownish green color, and we really see the reflection of the sunlight. We also know with water, because water is fluid, we see the reflections we see the movement of the water in the shapes of the reflections. As the water's broken up and flowing, we see those patterned shapes. The water patterns, if you know anything about canoeing or being on the water, you can see how deep the water is and where the rocks might be by how the water changes, the ripples change shape. So those tell us a lot. And then, of course, as the water is the closer we are to the water, the bigger those ripples are going to be. And the ones that are far away are going to be smaller. When I'm painting water, I get to look for those patterns. And I don't have to paint every tiny detail to make those patterns work. Let's see if we can't look at the black and white version again here. Hey, it worked this time. And so now you can really see those white reflections. And I often will convert my photo to black and white in order to better enable me to see patterns. You can also see how the land masses are very close in value from the back of the photo and on both the left and right. And that really helps to frame that river shape. And so those are things I would look for as I paint. I know that the land masses are different colors. And so I could have some fun painting that large dark shape, but changing the color inside it slightly to and still treating it as one shape. That's one fun way to create that water landscape. This is another water scene, and Christy Jacobson, if you're here, you'll remember this spot because we got to paint in Saskatchewan together in August, and we were standing on the lake of this, or on the side of this lake, and painting the pelicans and seabirds on the water birds on the rocks. This one, we see the water doesn't have that brownish tinge that we see in my river scene. Instead, we see a lot of blue. And that blue tells us not just about the water, but it tells us about the weather that day. And we see the shape of the water as well. We see the ripples. And it's interesting because as I'm studying this picture, one thing I'm realizing about myself is that I almost want to overlook reflections in the water. My brain kind of turns off, and all I want to see and paint is blue. And so it's important to me to notice that from the rocks we see a dark shadow extending down. We see those grayish white shapes of the rocks and the birds. And they're a little bit elongated. The shape of them is kind of broken up by the ripples in the water. Those are all things I want to pay attention to. Also, because the blues here do change in value, converting my photo to black and white helps me to understand a little bit more about how my blues might change in value as I paint this scene. And painting the ripple patterns accurately is going to help me to create that sense of distance. Having those bigger ripple shapes, they're a little bit like in the foreground, the ripples are a little bit broader and a little further apart. And then in the far distance, they feel more like it almost looks speckled to me in the further distance. And the lines of those ripples are much closer together. So those are things I would want to try to give a suggestion of in my painting. Let's see, what else do we have here? Oh, here's a beautiful waterfall. Let's pause and study this one for a moment and just think about the colors that we see, especially looking for patterns maybe in the white and the dark values as well. I'm just going to give you a moment to study this photo. So as we look at this one, we know that a lot of white water equals a lot of movement. We've got that foam and action here. We see the rocks peeking through where the water is a little bit thinner, where it's not cascading over in such volume. Thinner is not really the right word. And then we have that beautiful glacial turquoise color. And near the rocks where the water starts to cascade over, we also see some of those rocks showing through and making that glacial turquoise color a little bit darker. So those are all things we can look for as we paint water. And I think waterfalls actually are a great choice. If you're new to painting water and you want to dive in, pun intended, dive into painting a waterfall, because we see very strong contrasts in the waterfall. You can get away with kind of altering some of the shapes and adding a little bit. If your color gets a little bit darker, maybe you don't have all the whites that are showing in your original reference, you've gone and added a bit more color. That just means there's a little less water cascading over and maybe a little more rock showing through. So waterfalls can actually be very forgiving if you're new to watercolor. And you're wanting to paint water. So that's a really good place to start. Now I'm going to switch over. Let's see what else we can see here. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, this one I had to throw in. I probably wouldn't paint this reference photo because it is got a few issues. It's not the most gorgeous photo in the world, but boy, does it show just another of the moods of painting water. This is an early morning on this sunny little lake, and the water's very, very calm. So we've got a very crisp reflection. But because the sun is so bright, we also have very strong reflection from the sun. And that's what makes it, I guess, not ideal to paint. We also are seeing in the foreground, we're seeing right through that water into the weeds below. It's quite a shallow lake and very weedy. And so in painting this, I think it'd be really interesting because the sky up above is very blue, and we've got that bright sunshine. Down below, where we're mirroring the top, the everything above the water, we also, as we move away from the reflection of the trees, we'd start to create some pattern to show the weeds underneath. And that would be a very interesting challenge to try to accomplish. But I just like the way this really does show us how water is reflective and transparent at the same time. And being able to think abstractly, once again, zooming in. Let's get in real close and slide down to the foreground. You know, zooming in like this really helps us to kind of abstract what we see. I always want to get out of my literal mind that says, or not it's not even literal, the one that says, okay, I know what I see. We've got blue water, we've got green trees, we've got reflections. I want to get into the part of my brain that's saying, okay, what do I actually see? What's really there? Okay, this is a little video, and I wanted to play this one because we also see that water being fluid is changing all the time, and that can make it hard for us to paint water. So let's just, I should mute it. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, this is just the patterns on the water. I've got kids skipping stones. And we can see the color changes, where it's reflecting, we've got blue, and then also where it's kind of flowing toward me. It's not reflecting the sky quite so much, so instead we see kind of the more brown tones that we can see through the water. So the reflective part of the water is much more likely to show us the sky or the objects around that would be reflecting into the water. And then wherever it's not as reflective, it's in shadow or whatever, then we see through it just a bit more. And I wanted to show you this because of this photo. I was taking a walk, and it was early in the spring. There was just a little bit of water in the ditch, and the wind was blowing so that there were actually ripples in the puddles. And so and I unfortunately I didn't take a video so we can compare it, but we saw those same ripples that we see in our river scene here. It was the water was really moving, and I didn't see any strong forms like any strong shapes in the water aside from those reflections. But when I took my photograph and then looked at my photograph in the camera, I could see those tree trunks, those vertical shapes so strongly, because my camera froze that moment. When I took the photo, the water was just maybe a little bit smoother. The ripples had paused for, I don't know, it paused those ripples, I guess, was what I'm saying. And it shocked me because I had not realized those tree reflections were that strong. And I would not, if I'd taken a mental picture in my head and then gone home to paint it, I would have painted the water very, very rippled, a lot like our reference photo here. My water would have had that broken up pattern. But if I go home with my camera and go to paint my reference photo, it's going to actually be different than what I remembered. And this, to me, actually, this was the one thing that made me really want to talk about this with you as a class. Talking about learning to see like an artist, because what my camera caught and what my eye saw were so different. I saw that broken up pattern, but my camera caught something that wasn't quite the same. And so this is why we have to figure it out. We have to reconcile what we're seeing in our photographs with what we think and feel and remember. And we get to find our place in how we express that. And it is a combination. And this one, here's another little water moving video. This is actually quite a bit closer to where I took that photo of my trees, tree reflections. But you can see as I move the camera around through the scene, how the colors of the water changes, how over here there's quite a strong reflection. It's very, very blue. But as we look down, we see more of a grayish, brownish, greenish color. We start to see the grass and mud underneath. It just changes as we look, as we change our angle. as we look more closely, as we get in nice and close to the scene, we just, everything starts to change. And this is why water is so fascinating to paint. But we also need to learn how to just isolate what we see, how to break it down and learn to paint it. So enough showing you photos of my boring water. This is just something I'm nerding out on a little bit. I want to get better at painting these things, and so it's important to me to show it to you. And so there we go. So now you're seeing what I see. Now let's flip over to my, I'm going to quickly check back to my notes here. Okay, so we've got some keys to remember. And I want to mention as well that this isn't just about water, because there are other things that require this kind of approach. If you're painting, often I'll see in Facebook groups talking about painting, you'll see somebody pop up and say, what color paint should I use for painting a silver teapot? And I know you know this already. If you're painting anything that is reflective, it's going to be the color of whatever it's reflecting. So a silver teapot, we're not painting silver, we're painting the colors that are reflected in that silver teapot. It works for the same way for glass and crystal, for any kind of metal, chrome, steel, reflective surface. My friend Karen Romani has been painting shop windows in Paris, and so she's painting both the reflection of the outdoors and then what you see in the window. And you know, she's training herself. She's using this complicated subject to train herself to see both what is through and what is reflected up against. And so she's really training herself to be very, very literal in what her reference photo is telling her. We don't have to be completely literal and tied to our reference photo, but we want to learn how to see literally, so then we can take that and paint from it. Few keys to remember. I always ask myself, where are my lightest values? Where are my whites? I want to create pattern to show movement. So if I'm seeing ripples and reflections, I want to look for the pattern, see that way those ripples curve, and then that's what I paint. I need to change my color if I want to show depth and movement. It involves often a color change as well as a value change. And we also look for edges and softness. Where do I need to kind of blur things together to show maybe distance, to show that flow? And where do I create those crisp edges to define and show movement? And those are all things that I'm looking for. We're going to do a little bit of painting right now. I don't have a ton of time, but I have a little bit, and we're going to take a look at one of our scenes here. I'm not really sure which one we should paint, to tell you the truth, but you know, I have some reference photos on my work surface, so I think what we'll just do is switch over to the work surface and do a little bit of exploration there. And something that really helps me here is doing a small quick study. And so we're going to just take a reference photo and try to capture some of those shapes really quickly, kind of in a visual shorthand. So what have we got here? We've got this guy, and then we have our river here. I think we're going to work from this one. I have never painted this before. It's not actually the best reference photo, but I think it's a good example of how to look for water, how to patterns, and how to really start to see those contrasts. Quick drink of water. When my son was about 2, he had a teddy bear that he named Drinka Waka. It always makes me laugh. I'm just going to quickly wet my palette. Wake up the color. Okay, so what do we see? Because I have the black and white version and the color version, that's going to help me to kind of break down my scene. I like to also kind of squint at it, look for those lightest values, and we're going to make this pretty speedy. I talk about simplifying because when you can get to the heart Um, this is I think the difference between rendering and design. Rendering and design, getting that foundational basic shape, and then we stylize over top of that. So that's why I try to simplify. You know, when I can get to that foundational pop of what my scene is, what my scene is made of, that mass of bright color where the light was hitting it, and then that beautiful counterpoint of the blue sky and the water, and then those darks that just popped up like exclamation points all over. That was what made this work for me, and I was able to get to the heart of that because I have to mention this. I've tried to paint this scene many times, and there have been many times I've been much closer to literally interpreting the reference photo, which has given me the freedom to kind of stylize beyond it. And that reminds me, I have this guy too. This one was a less successful version of the same reference photo. And I was learning, I bought a few samples of aquaboard. So that's what this is. It's like it's a little bit of a, what is it, MDF board. And then they've put a water, some kind of watercolor ground onto it so you can paint on it. I like the texture it's showing. How I feel about aquaboard, this is my first time trying it, so I really can't comment. I'd be interested to hear if you've tried it and what you think of it. Okay, I'm stalling and I shouldn't be. Let's just paint. Okay, so we've got our reference photo. Let's throw some land into the scene to give us the ability to paint around the land. It gives us a bit of a frame for our water, so sometimes that's just a better way to go. I could paint sky first, but I just don't think we really have the time for that today, so we're going to just get right to the heart of the scene and get those distant hills in. And remember how I talked about that massive trees and this shape all being one? So let's do that as well. I'm just going to transition this color here to a brown and pull down my cliff, basically just like so. So I've just added a bit of brown, I think it's hematite burnt scarlet, to my green palette dirt that I had here. And we want to just let that suggest the land mass. We really are trying to simplify so I can see if I can paint the water successfully. I'm really wanting to get to do the water first, and then we build out from there. We will also suggest this land mass over here, which kind of connects with the bank down here. And again, simplify, simplify, simplify. I really want to get right to the heart of the scene, so I want to work in major shapes. And I know so much about this location. I've been there, I've visited it, and I don't want to start putting in all my insider information at this point. I really just want to think about what I see. I want to pop a little bit of blue, and I need to find the right blue, and I don't have one that I like. There's a little bit of blue water over here. We'll just indicate it there. And then we have the water here is a blue color as well. And very often in the first layer, we want to think about connecting all of those different elements in the scene. That gives us soft edges so that we can adjust shapes later on if we want to. Okay, the mass of the white reflections are down here. So as I move down, I'm going to get, my color is going to start to change. And I can't identify very well this color. It's kind of a blue, it's kind of transitions to a brown. So we're just going to kind of work with some muddy hues and see if we can't get close to it. That's kind of a nice color. And I'm going to start breaking up the shape here. and leaving some little white reflections. Again, this is my very first time trying this, and so this is my journey of discovery. This is all the stuff I don't know what I don't know until I start to paint it. And then I see all the potential problems as my lack of information in some areas is going to start to stand out. There's some really big dark ripples in here, so rather than seeing the white areas and wanting to paint around them, I'm going to try to concentrate instead on seeing those dark patterns and trying to paint them. So it's not what I'm not painting, it's about what I do see that I can paint, if that makes sense. And that's kind of a change for me, because I usually just try to see what I shouldn't paint, and maybe that's a mistake. Maybe I'm overly complicating the situation by doing that. Because there's a lot of little white sparkles in there, there's a lot of detail, we don't need to work to that level. That's why I talked about wanting to see the pattern. We paint the pattern instead of the exact detail, and that's going to work better. I have a teenager to pick up from school in a few minutes. They get to go to school 1 day a week here in BC now. So this was his first day back, and he'll get about 3 of those before they're done for the year. So it's a little bit weird, but so we're going to wrap up in a few minutes, but I just want to he can wait. It won't kill him to wait in a few extra minutes while I wrap this up here. So I'm just wanting to continue to see that pattern. It all kind of curves in a point down towards this way. I'm working fast, and I'm really trying to use my eyes, look at the scene, and then very quickly paint without overthinking. There's a really nice kind of curve. Whites here. The whites seem whiter if our darks are darker, so that means you get to be a little bit brave about some of the colors I'm putting on the paper here. And then maybe some line here. The other thing I could do is I'll probably want to come back afterwards and put some of these little tiny fine ripple marks. So you could actually I could actually leave a larger white space that I could fill in after. But I'm a big fan of trying to get that first impression down really quickly. I am working on a large sheet. This is a 1/4 sheet of watercolor paper, so about 11 by 15. You do not have to work this big. Feel free to do your pattern study a little bit smaller in a size that's more comfortable for you. One thing that I could do as well, I'm really liking this area, the colors that are in here. I'm feeling like maybe I'd get away better with softening some of this stuff and keeping the bulk of my white patterns in this area. I think this shape could have come down a little bit further here and been softer so that my white reflections are all in this area. One thing that I could do is, if I'm really struggling with this, I could get up close and personal with just this section and just explore it as a abstract of these few square inches and see, what do I see? Really get to know that part. The more I do this, the easier and more confidently I'll be able to paint this in future. This is just a beginning of that exploration, learning to understand those ripples and create that sense of movement. This is a little bit all over the place. I feel like it's just too busy to really give that movement of the water that I wanted to get. So what if I took a stronger stance and started to see a pattern carrying through from right to left here. So maybe it comes this way, and then here this one flows and comes down that way. So maybe I just need to change up my shapes so that they carry right across. Painting a muddy river is a really good way of playing with some really fun neutral colors. Yeah, I'm going to have to come back to this because I just need to get it to know it even better. One thing I like is that the more that I do this, the more I see what I can get away with. My first tendency has been to put those little white spaces all over the river. And I can see as I work on this that maybe I need to blur out some of this detail. And that's something we haven't talked about today, but we're going to be talking about that next week, is blurring out, learning how to see not just in value in black and white like this to see those lights and darks, but also learning to see those patterns by letting go of detail. And we're going to be talking about some strategies for doing that, which I think is a really good place to wrap this up, because detail, you can see it starts to become a distraction. When we're really closely tied to the detail in our reference photo, it can get really hard to depict that as a pattern and in the abstract. Okay, I'm going to just take a minute. Okay, I see Elizabeth commenting she's tried aquaboard a couple of times. Takes a light touch with lifting and you can't drench it with water. Yeah, I definitely, I felt like it wasn't as, it didn't lift as easily as I thought it might. It's not like Yupo, it does hold the paint a little bit more than that. So that was a good thing to notice. Okay, we will be, let's see here. Yeah, we'll be talking about this more next week. This is a series, and we're going to just keep digging into this for as long as it takes. I'd love to hear your questions as you wrestle with taking what you see and taking your brain, which is just full of ways to try to make everything 3D. We want to learn how to capture what we see and just smack it down on that paper. And it's a challenge. We want to share what we feel, and we want to figure out that beautiful tension between rendering and design, between literal interpretation and self-expression and totally abstract. It's just a challenge, and these are problems we get to wrestle with as artists, and they're really good problems to wrestle with. It's easy to feel because I don't, the demonstration I just did for you isn't a powerful, instant solution for my reference photo. It's not, oh, this is exactly what I needed to do. It's no, I'm seeing things I struggle with, things I don't know enough about, and so my painting's a little bit all over the place. If I want to be confident, if I want to be expressive in how I share this, I need to spend more time getting to know this subject, painting this subject, and learning to see. And we get to do that together. So thank you for joining me today. I'm going to wrap this up, and I just want to thank you for being here. We will be talking again about learning to see like an artist next week. And again, I'd love to hear your questions. Don't forget, you can mention them, bring them up anytime in our Fearless Artist community at fearlessartist.net. Bye for now.